Now, when it comes to the different socket types, right, we were just looking at what the processor looks like, and that's what's called a socketed processor. There was a point in time where we were using slotted processors, where the processor would look like an expansion card on a motherboard. But most of the processors have gone back now to the socketed type of processor. And I'll tell you what here, there's two main manufacturers of processors in today's world, Intel and AMD. So first we have Intel, and Intel processors use what's called an LGA type setup, which stands for Land Grid Array. Okay, that's what type of package it uses. Where basically the underside of the CPU has hundreds of contact points that line up with the socket pins. So what you see on the screen in front of you, you should probably just, study this before you go take the exam, because these are the different types of processor packages that they have. There's LGA 775, 1155, 1156, and 1366. And you'll see here that the LGA 775 was the exclusive server and desktop socket for many years. If you look at what types of processors you have, it's the older ones, right? You have the old Pentium 4, and believe it or not, remember how I talked about 286, 386, 486, and then we moved to the Pentium? Well, to give you an idea how old we're talking about, here we have Pentium 4, which of course was after the Pentium 2, the Pentium 3. Matter of fact, we actually had things in between like the Pentium MMX. If you go back and look at the history, you'll see there's all sorts of old Pentium processors. In today's modern world, you won't see anything, realistically, anything older than the Pentium 4, a Celeron. There's also something called the Pentium 4 Extreme, the Core 2 Duo, the Core 2 Quad, Xeon, and there are many others because, again, we could go further back in time. We have the LGA 1155, which uses something called Sandy Bridge or Ivy Bridge architecture. And again, I'm not going to get into the details. This is kind of stuff, again, just study and memorize for the exam. It's your core i3, i5, and i7 processors, which are more of what we see in today's processing world. But we do go back to the old Pentiums, Celerons, and Xeons as well. We have the LGA 1156, which is the pre-Sandy Bridge architecture. This is not that old, though, because we're still talking about the core i3, 5, 7, Pentium, Celeron, and Xeon. Okay, so the only difference between the 1155 and 56 is Sandy Bridge or not Sandy Bridge. Then we have the LGA 1366, which is what we used for the original i7 processors. It has Core i7, Xeon, Celeron. Okay, so some of the original processors that fall into that series. There's not a lot I can tell you here. I mean, this is just kind of a grid, so to speak. I know I didn't format it here in the form of a grid, but I might as well have. It's a form of a grid just to memorize for the exam. Now, one other thing that I could mention here is if you're wondering about the numbers, why is it LGA 775, 1155, 1150? Where these numbers come from? Well, they have to do with the number of pins. Okay, so the pin count with the processor. Although I do want to caution you. Well, there's a couple of things I want to say here. Number one, I don't know that you ever really need to know the exact pin count of a processor. I mean, I suppose if you're ever looking at a socket and the socket shows a number, well, then that number again is going to represent the number of pins, so you want to get a matching processor. But the second thing I want to caution you on is just because these processors may have the actual pin count listed in the name, I don't want you to get thrown off in the future if you see some other processor. And I'll tell you, even as of right now, I don't know that I can speak for every single processor in existence and say that every single one, the number that is tied in with the name represents a pin count. So, again, a little trivial piece of information. Thought I'd throw it out there at you. There is the second manufacturer, however, that I mentioned, and it's called AMD. And AMD, well, they have their own series of chipset packages. They actually use something called PGA, which is a pin grid array, and that's where you actually have these pins that are on the underside of a processor, and they align with the holes in the sockets. When using an AMD processor, when using a PGA based processor, and I will tell you some of the old Intel processors also use these PGAs. I'll tell you what, it was so easy to bend these pins. I mean, it took nothing for these pins to accidentally get bent. So you had to be really careful when you line up the pins with the holes and put it into the actual motherboard. Now, I am going to have a demonstration for you in a later lesson where I go through and show you what this stuff all looks like and show you how to build a computer. And I'll show you how these sockets and the pins and how they're really, really sensitive, and you got to be really careful with them. But again, I'm not going to go through this whole grid here, but you have this whole different socket type, okay, with the 940, AM2, AM2 plus, AM3, AM3 plus, which, I will tell you, the 940, AM2, and AM2 plus all had 940 pins. The AM3 has 941. The AM3 plus has 942. We had the FMI, which only had 905 pins, and the F series, which have 1,207 pins. Yay. Okay, I'm just kind of throwing out trivial information. Okay, I just want to make sure that you just kind of have this information in case it's thrown at you on an exam.